Now we've reached a part of the dialogue where we have two reformulations of what Sophrosine is. First, there is Critias' reformulation, according to which Sophrosine is now a knowledge of itself and of the other knowledges. There's quite a lot of matter of significance to remark here. First of all, since it's also of the other knowledges, then presumably the general picture is such that the other knowledges do not have this kind of self-knowledge, whatever that means. So concretely, if you think of something like carpentry, it will be the knowledge of how to make the various things that you make by carpentry. Let's just keep to the plain Heideggerian example of a table or a chair, something like that. Now, this kind of knowledge then probably, according to this picture, doesn't have what is here called a knowledge of itself, which Sophrosine, on the contrary, does. What exactly this kind of knowledge of itself could be will turn out to be a big problem, not very long further on in the text. But for now, let's just notice this. It's also significant in this same definition that we are now talking about a knowledge of itself. Remember earlier when we had the Delphian inscription, the starting point was to know yourself. So now, in Critias' formulation, his reformulation, it is not a knowledge of oneself, but a knowledge of itself. So in other words, the focus for his definition now is not the person as such, but the knowledge as such. So he really is talking about a specific knowledge that is such that it has a knowledge of the other knowledges and of itself. In other words, it relates to carpentry and all the others, probably then, and it relates also to itself somehow as an object of knowledge. This is, of course, a rather special situation in that such a knowledge needs to have some kind of reflexivity going on that is probably denied to the other knowledges. What more concretely can Critias have in mind? Because a lot of the discussion now is carried out on such an abstract level that you could try to fill in quite a lot of different things. But probably, from what we know of Critias both in the dialogue and outside the dialogue, it's very likely that something like political activity is a main thing here. Really sort of ruling the city, which would mean knowledgeably ruling the other knowledges, the other competences, the other crafts, not just carpentry, but things like the military, things like maintenance of streets and buildings, setting up for festivals, all of these things that together make up the activities and the lives of a city. Somehow, to the extent that these other things are knowledges, then Sophrosine would now be the knowledge of them and itself. So it's probably thought of as not just knowing, but also as somehow ruling with that knowledge. At least this knowledge is what will enable you to rule. And, of course, that's not mentioned at this point, but to rule well somehow. We know, as we've discussed earlier, that historically speaking, there's a very exciting situation there because Critias did go on to rule, and very few, if anyone, would say that he did so well in the end. But that doesn't mean that now, perhaps something like 30 years prior to that, he can't be open to the idea of a proper good kind of rule. This also reminds us that the question of value, as we've called it, is right under the surface here. Because if what he has in mind is political rule, of course the idea is also to rule well. And it's not mentioned here, but the thing of it being good seems to be something that's right under the surface and could and should be pulled up pretty soon. Also, again, keep in mind this distinction between good for the whole, for the others, presumably for what's being ruled then, or for what's being known, and good for the person who has the sophrosina, the sophron person. Are we thinking primarily of one, the other, or both? Moving on then to Socrates Reformulation, which comes in fact before they're done discussing Critias Reformulation. In Socrates Reformulation, sophrosina is knowledge of what a person knows or does not know. So it's back to the idea of a person. That's an important thing. It's also important that Socrates has spent quite a bit of energy re-importing and bringing in the idea of not just knowledge, but also the limits to knowledge, namely what one does not know. Another thing that's well worth noticing at this point is that the definition of sophrosina doesn't then seem to really make much of a distinction between the first person and the second or third person. What I mean by this is that it's what a person knows, what someone knows and does not know, and that's kind of irrespective of whether it's you yourself, the one with sophrosina, or someone else. So if this should turn out to be something like a method, for instance, then the method can be applied pretty much equally to oneself and to others. That also suggests that there is no particular or privileged access to oneself. The idea of sophrosina, if this is what sophrosina is something that allows you to find out about knowledge and the limits of knowledge in all cases, including your own. There's also an early hint here of something that may become more clear later on in the dialogue, namely the idea that this is something like an ability that you might have. We can think of knowledge as just something that's simply finished and done with, so that once you possess it, you're good to go and everything is sort of finished. Or you can think of it more as an ability to find out about things. And these are really quite different. And it seems that the Socratic reformulation at this point is more of the kind that a method or an ability would be. And that also suggests that it may not be necessarily something that's just finished. Once you've got the knowledge, you're done and all is well. It may be just an ability that enables you to go on one level, perhaps go on finding out as what this ability is all about. Now, in the ensuing discussion of Critias reformulation, some rather abstract and formal problems crop up. One of them has to do with what it means to relate to others, other knowledges, and to itself in the same or in different ways. And in order to spell out the problem, Socrates brings in analogies. So the suggestion that this knowledge knows itself and other knowledges in a way that other knowledges don't, if we think of sight as an analog, it would be a kind of sight that didn't really see the seeings, the objects of the seeings, but it just saw the seeings. It would be like a meta seeing your normal seeings of color, but it wouldn't really see the colors, it would just see the seeings of color. And that's confusing. Same with hearing. As an analog, it would be a kind of hearing that didn't really hear anything, but in a way it heard the hearings. And at the same time, to top it off, it can somehow hear itself. So that means that you have a structure here that seems, if we just stick to the seeing analogy, some kind of model that, if you want to really press it, perhaps requires three kinds of color, because you have one kind of color that is seen by the normal everyday seeings, and then in order for this fantastic meta-seeing, that would be the analog of Sophrosine, to be able to see it, it would have to have some kind of color type 2. The seeing itself would have to have a color type 2. And in order for Sophrosine to see itself, it gets even worse. We need a kind of color type 3 in order for this to happen. If it's a kind of seeing, the way that Sophrosine is a kind of knowledge. Now, this is, of course, it's just set up as an analogy. So it's not the same thing as a knockdown argument at all, but it is certainly an invitation to think long and hard about what do you mean when you say that you have a knowledge that is a knowledge of knowledges and at the same time a knowledge of itself. Do you mean in this way, or do you mean in some other way? And these are very real issues here. And the part of the technical vocabulary, of course, has to do with reflexivity. So reflexivity here is the fact that it can sort of relate to itself. This has a distant cousin in some of the things said about the ideas in the Republic, because the ideas, of course, they are not persons looking out at anything else, but the ideas too have this kind of position of being themselves what they give to other things, so that the idea of the good is good more than all the other things that participate in it somehow on a lower level. The idea of the beautiful is perfect beauty in a way that, you know, all the other things depend upon in order for them to be beautiful in some way or in some respect or to some degree. Now, like I said, this is a kind of a distant cousin, but it's partly the same kind of issue of reflexivity. Another topic that comes up here, and that has been brought further by, for instance, Aristotle in the tradition, is the idea of relatives, which is also very relevant here. Now, a relative in Aristotle is the kind of thing that is what it is by relating to something else. So the greater than is what it is by relating to something else, namely the smaller than. You get the general drift. So this is a way of existing. It's not one of the sort of top-notch forms of being. It depends always on other kinds of being, but it is a way in which things are. And so it seems that this discussion is also a discussion of relatives of some kind, because Sophrosine, according to Critias' definition, would appear to be the kind of thing that is what it is, at least partly by relating to something else, namely these other knowledges. And there too, of course, you get the question of how do we make this work? Does it have the same relation to itself as to the other things? Again, if we look just at the plain example of the greater than and the smaller than, then it would be the analog of being greater than itself? That's probably not possible. So there are issues here. Again, none of these are knockdown arguments, but they are, as analogies so often are when Socrates brings them in, they are things that force you to be clearer about what is it that you mean exactly. Finally, a thing that comes back now, and even the term is used, dynamis. Dynamis is an ability. So it's something that can be activated in various ways. And at this stage in the text, the term dynamis is actually used about what it means for Sophrosyne to be what it is. Now, a dynamis has normally has at least two kinds of characteristics. One is that it is a dynamis over something else. So there is some kind of a relation. You can think of this as a power or a capacity. The other, of course, is that a dynamis is also something specific. It's something determined by what it does and by what objects it relates to. So again, this is, I think, a slight advancement on the idea of Sophrosyne not being just a set of knowledge, thought of as just, for instance, a set of sentences or something that you can just learn, but more something like an ability or like a capacity that relates to something and that has a power in that respect.